Today's Water Agency regular meeting here for the Port Hueneme Water Agency, Monday, November 18th, 2019 at City Hall, calling the meeting to order. And would we have a roll call, please?
Member Hernandez, Member Marcus, Member Rollins, Ex officio Member Jacobson, Vice Chair Bouchard,
Here.
and Chair Munoz-Schnapp.
Here, so
For
we
the-
have, go ahead.
For the record, Members Hernandez and Marcus are absent.
Right, so we have a quorum. We reserve some time on the agenda for public comment, so anyone in the public wishing to speak on matters not on the agenda may do so at this time. So seeing nobody approach the podium, we'll move on to agenda approval for the water agency today.
I'll move to approve the agenda.
Okay, is there a second? Second, all right. Motion is made and seconded. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? None? All right, so motion carries unanimously. And we don't have a presentation, but we'll move on to the consent agenda. And we have minutes of the Water Agency regular meeting of October 21st, 2019 to look at, as well as finance cash disbursements for October 12th through November 8th, 2019 to review.
I'll move to approve both consent agenda item 1 and 2.
Okay, is there a second? All right, motion is made and seconded. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? None. So motion carries unanimously. And then I do see Member Marcus approaching the dais.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Thank you. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
So, Madam City Clerk, I do see that there is a roll call vote for the consent calendar. Okay, so we don't need, okay. All right, so let's move on to business items, and we are on item number 3 on the agenda, Brackish Water Reclamation Demonstration Facility Operational Report, and that's Mr. Villafana.
Good afternoon, Board. For the month of October, PHWA used 3.41 million gallons per day, and that is less than we used in September, which was 3.49 million gallons. Last October, we used less than we did this October. We used 3.25. And for the entire month of October, the plant was operational, meaning the silt density indexes were all below 3, which is the threshold. They were never higher than 1.3, so that's all good news for us because we were operating. The water split this month was approximately 79% from United and approximately 21% from Callegas. Mr. Martinez and I were working on the budget. We'll be back on the 16th, but some good information as far as the budget is concerned. Right now, we have reserves of over $500,000, and it appears that the wholesale cost for water is going to be approximately the same as last year, coming from United. So there's going to be a little shift between the fixed and variable costs, but the wholesale cost will be approximately the same. So wanted to let you know that Mr. Martinez and I are working on the budget, and we will be back here on the 16th with a PowerPoint presentation on the budget. Are there any questions?
Okay, are there any questions for staff? No questions? Okay,
Don't we need a motion, receive and file?
receive and
report?
file, yes, we do.
So moved.
Okay,
Second.
all right, thank you. Motion's made and seconded, and all those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? None? All right, so motion moves unanimously. We'll move on then to business item number 4, overview of groundwater ordinance process update. And is that Mr. Villafana or is that Mr. Candy?
That's Mr. Candy. Hi.
Okay, all right,
Good
thank you.
afternoon. while we wait for the projector to come down, I've got a little bit of PowerPoint to present to you. I'm going to talk about the ordinance that Fox Canyon Groundwater Management Agency adopted in October 23 this year. It was a long time coming. I think they were working on their ordinance for at least 2 years plus. The ordinance is comprehensive. We've got, how do I advance here? Let's just figure this out. Got it. Okay. So there's a number of pieces to the ordinance, but before I go through those pieces, I think it's important to point out that the ordinance itself is really a component of the overall groundwater sustainability plan, which the GMA has not adopted yet. Statutory deadline to adopt the GSP, Groundwater Sustainability Plan, is January 31st this coming year. But they have taken a major step in adopting this first component of the plan, which is key. It's really if you spend any time looking at the GSP itself, it's the primary management action that's been identified by the GMA in terms of achieving sustainability over a 20-year period. This ordinance is the first step in that process. It establishes initial allocations, and it's phase one of that process. The ordinance is going to be a phase two, which deals with reductions over the 20-year ramp down. We expect it to be 20 years. Anyway, these are the major groupings, topic areas within the ordinance. We can focus on any of these that you'd like to. You got questions about. Some are a little bit more complicated than others. Some might be more important to you than others. We can pass over any ones that you don't have a lot of questions about, not interested in hearing about. But let's jump into it. We'll go to the overview I prepared. Pretty simple. This ordinance is intended to replace the extraction allocations that are currently in place through Emergency Ordinance E. Generally, the ordinance is set up so that allocations are assigned to extraction facilities with the intention to transfer at some point in the future to a land-based allocation system. That's where, instead of tying extraction to facilities, extraction to be tied to the land where the water is actually used. It's a very optimistic concept that the GMA board and staff has. I think difficult, everybody would agree, to implement, but something that would be very worthwhile given the difficulties that come up when you have an ordinance and extraction allocations that are assigned to facilities and not actually the land where the water is used. As I mentioned before, the ordinance establishes only initial extraction allocations. It's really phase one of the ordinance. Phase two is going to deal with future reductions, and we haven't seen anything in that regard yet. We haven't seen any drafts, and I think there has probably been some internal communications, and staff has some sense of where they're going to go, but they haven't published anything with respect to phase two of the ordinance. So let's jump into initial allocations. I think probably the most important point here is that the base period from which these initial allocations are established is a 2005 through 2014 base period. That base period is probably the most controversial aspect about the ordinance. There's a number of parties that weren't happy with that particular base period, both in M&I and the M&I group, as well as agriculture. That base period, for one, affects this agency disproportionately as compared to the T base period, which is 2003 to 2012. So this base period shifts that 10-year period back 2 years, and that has an effect on this agency because the agency was using less water in those 2 years. That base period affects other operators within the M&I group a little more favorably. City of Ventura being one. Anyway, we've talked about that in the past, and the agency is on record having opposed the base period that was selected. That's 2005 through 2014. More recently, however, though, agricultural group, a large, I would call, a number of prominent landowners have come forward with council, and they have made it very clear that they're not interested in this base period, and it'll remain to be seen whether they actually take legal action to challenge it. I haven't heard anything in that regard, but they have lawyered up, so to speak, and have definitely, put the shot across the bow. So stay tuned on that. But with respect to these initial allocations, important for a lot of operators that those that have more than one extraction facility, that you can actually combine your allocation with respect to those extraction facilities to accumulate extraction allocation and pump. That gives you flexibility to move around. I don't know that that affects this agency so much as it's really United Water Conservation District that's supplying the groundwater to the agency. In that regard, there is an important clarification that we had put into the ordinance that I refer to as really a place marker, a placeholder, recognizing that it's United that is exercising the allocation in trust for Port Hueneme Water Agency and other contractors on the pipeline, that it is not necessarily their allocation, but really if one of the contractors were to withdraw from the agreement, the OH pipeline agreement, there would be discussion as to where does the allocation go? Can the contractor step away from the agreement with the allocation? Is it the contractor's allocation, or is it United's allocation? United's position is it's their allocation. Those contractors feel differently about that, and sort of this compromise placeholder language was put in the ordinance, and it tracks really what's in the OH pipeline agreement itself. And it was a fair amount of work to get staff and also the board to go along with the language, but ultimately they agreed, and we were able to work it out with the city of Oxnard on appropriate language, and so it was good.
And I remember that being really an initiative by this group that said, this is what we need from this, and that was the challenge that you took to the table for us, so.
Yes, absolutely. And then Oxnard joined in that, and together we moved it along, and we're trying to work well with Oxnard on these issues, and I think we came to a good place on it, which is good. But again, it doesn't answer the question. It just puts the place marker there. So let's move on then and just talk about the justification that the GMA has put forth for their particular selection of a base period. And it's really that it represents a complete climate cycle in terms of precipitation, groundwater extractions, and in-lieu deliveries from the Santa Clara River. That's what they've put forward. They declined to adopt the M&I group's recommendation, if I could call it that, with respect to base period. It's really more of a preferred base period, which is the T period. Anyway, they went with that, the 2005-2014, and again, the ag folks have expressed their dissatisfaction with that, and it remains to be seen what they do with it. While we're on the topic of initial allocation, there's a couple of unique circumstances where there needed to be carved out some special treatment for agencies, particularly Pleasant Valley County Water District, and also the folks that are receiving Santa Clara surface water. Pleasant Valley, as some of you may know, receives deliveries from the Canal Creek project into their service area, and they use that water in lieu of pumping groundwater, and have for a number of years. They felt like that supply may not be a completely reliable supply, and if it ever went away, because they'd been using that supply during the base period, they would be penalized by it if they weren't able to get extraction allocation that equaled the amount of their surface water deliveries from the Canal Creek project. So they did a good job, went to work with staff and the GMA, and were able to carve out a special, I don't want to call it an exception, but special allocation with respect to that Canal Creek water. The way the GMA has treated it is it's a permanent addition to their extraction allocation, roughly 5,000 acre feet. And in any year in which they actually take that water, it's a one-to-one, reduce its extraction on a one-to-one basis for each acre foot it receives from the Canal Creek project. So permanent increase in their allocation, and then one-to-one reduction as to how much water comes down the conduit to their service area. Any questions about that before we go on to the Santa Clara River surfers? None of this affects too dramatically the Port Hueneme Water Agency in terms of its initial allocation and how it works, although it remains to be seen how a lot of these special circumstances are going to be dealt with in terms of phase 2 of the ordinance when we're talking about reductions. And I think that's where I say the rubber meets the road, in terms of we'll see how all this works out. This is really just, the first round, and there's a lot to be determined with respect to the second round and how everybody's going to get ramped down to this what I consider to be a small safe yield number, which is going to be tough for everybody to live within.
Are there any questions for Mr. Candy at this point? No? Okay. Right.
Okay, so we'll move on to this concept of Santa Clara River water flex allocation. This is, in a lot of respects, it's the same type of situation as Canal Creek, although the GMA is treating it differently. Instead of a permanent increase to United's allocation with respect to the pumping trough pipeline and Pleasant Valley's allocation with respect to the Pleasant Valley pipeline, this is more of a borrowing concept. That's the way the GMA describes it. And basically, they've figured what have been the average annual deliveries over that base period. It's 15,600 acre feet per year. In any year that actual deliveries to these two pipeline facilities are less than those base period deliveries, Pleasant Valley and United, their extraction allocations will be increased by the difference. And then in any year that actual pipeline deliveries are greater than base period, so in years that there's a lot of water early on in the system, so a lot of surface water delivered, and so these deliveries are greater than that 15,600 acre feet, the extraction allocations for Pleasant Valley and United will be decreased by the difference. So, up and down, it's a flex allocation as they've referred to it. Now, there were some issues raised by United and I think seconded by Pleasant Valley that in years that there's a lot of water in the system initially, their allocation gets decreased, and then later in the year, late season irrigation, they're going to need some allocation to not incur surcharges when that surface water is no longer available. It's been delivered and used, and they need to go to the groundwater basin. But if these, if it's either flood or drought here, and if there's flood conditions and there's a lot of water coming down the system, they could theoretically get their extraction allocation reduced to nothing or even a negative number, in which case they'd be incurring surcharges for late season pumping and irrigation. And so the parties went to work negotiating this and explaining first the situation to the board, the GMA board, and they were able to get a 50% floor in place. So in wet water years, you're never going to have less than 50% of your extraction allocation. So that was protection that I think satisfied most folks enough to not be vehemently objecting to the ordinance adoption, and the board was able to get it done. The one last aspect with respect to the flex allocation is there's a true-up. So this isn't necessarily something that would apply to, Pleasant Valley and the Canal Creek, but on this borrowing, since, our extraction allocation is going up, when surface water is less and it's going down, when there's a lot of surface water, there's a 5-year true-up to determine if there's been any excess pumping over allocation. And surcharges would be paid on that basis. So that's the way that this rather, complicated concept of Santa Clara River Water Flex is supposed to work. A lot of folks have said it's way too complicated. It's probably not going to work, but the board adopted it, and that's what we're looking at. So any questions regarding that?
Any questions for Mr. Candy? No. All right.
Too complicated.
What's that?
Too complicated.
Too complicated.
Well, in 5 years, that seems a long period not to know. Isn't that what would happen?
That's right. I think there is some criticism to that effect. Like, are we really going to be able to chew this up after 5 years? And staff was able to convince the board that they felt like they could get it done and could keep track of this stuff well enough, and it was all going to be pretty easy, really. Remains to be seen. Okay, so we can spend as much time, like I said, on any of this stuff, and really, if there's something that's not really making sense, we can talk about it. But if not, I'll go on to the reporting part of the ordinance, and there's some new reporting requirements. So these are reporting requirements in addition to reporting metered extractions, which of course occurs under the existing ordinance and has occurred under past ordinances. These new reporting requirements are intended to facilitate this whole concept of moving to a land-based allocation system. And operators are required, so this is both agricultural and M&I operators are required to report all parcels served by the well, which has been assigned extraction allocation, and that would be in addition to their reporting the amount of groundwater pumped. With respect to certain categories of M&I pumpers, United Water Conservation District would fall into the special district, so I put that requirement up there. It's really the operators that are required to comply with these reporting requirements the way the ordinance is written. United would need to be reporting to the GMA with respect to all the water that it pumps and delivers to Port Hueneme Water Agency, and the water agency would also have to supply United with a list of parcels served, probably the acreage involved, and this is new information that the GMA is going to put into its database and start trying to figure out how to move to a land-based allocation system. Personally, I think that this is something that this agency should engage United on, because it's only through this reporting that the agency can sort of preserve a claim to its water rights, its fundamental underlying water rights, and by providing reports, or at least working with United to provide the GMA with reports that show where in the agency's service area, so that would be its member agencies' service areas, where that water is being used is important in terms of keeping the water right as well as the allocation out of United's hands and in the hands of the folks that are using it. So again, and when I say out of United's hands, United is holding this allocation in trust. They have a claim that it's their allocation. There's this sort of it's an agreement to disagree essentially on that point, and we don't need to be fighting that point necessarily right now. So it's we've we understand what their position is. They, I believe, understand what our position is that it's our allocation. When I say our allocation, it's contractor's allocation, and then sub-allocation amongst the member agencies of the water agency. And it seems to me that through this reporting process, we can make that link as to where, the water's being used, and I think it's important for many reasons to engage in that process and figure out how that reporting is going to take place with United.
Is there a question? Yes.
Yeah, Peter, it was my understanding, and maybe I'm wrong, and I was hopeful maybe because I haven't been on that side of things, that it was an aggregate reporting of all of the parcels by a municipal and industrial or an M&I or a city or PHWA or the beach district, aggregate of all of the parcels they're serving, but not the amount of water at each parcel being served. And the reason I ask that is the autonomy of the agency to continue to operate tiered rates. All of that can get a little screwy if you start getting down to the parcel in the meter, a little bit like the agriculture fight of who created.
Yeah.
So if you could respond maybe.
Yeah, absolutely. And I don't think that there's a requirement in the ordinance that you report parcel by parcel how much water is used. But you do absolutely have to identify the parcels that are using water. And then I think you're right, in the aggregate, how much water, total volume of water from each source being supplied, monthly water deliveries for all water being supplied. So those are aggregate numbers. And then a list of parcel numbers or GIS shapefile for those parcels served. So that's what the ordinance requires, and I think you're absolutely right.
I think the reason I asked the question is if I'm not, thank God I haven't looked at the ordinance since October 23rd. I'm not that crazy. I think it's an important aspect of the ordinance if it's written like the requirement, or is it distinct for M&I versus agriculture? Do you recall? Because we have to report water used, or Pleasant Valley does by parcel the amount of water.
There's distinct requirements, but what I'd have to do in response to your question is look at the requirements that apply to M&I and then look at the requirements that apply to ag. I've got the ordinance here. I could definitely do that, but they're slightly different requirements that apply to each category of user, M&I and ag.
And that's, as long as you've looked at it, I just satisfied that we're not, that PHWA or the member agencies aren't going to have to report water use by parcel or just distill it down that way.
That's my understanding, that they will not have to do that.
I just have a very quick question about the reporting. We've been reporting up until now, or we've always reported. How is this different from what has been the practice?
So
Until this ordinance.
you've been reporting the amount of groundwater extracted. This, I think, this is more specific reporting with respect to the different sources of water supplied, monthly water deliveries, so that's broken down by month, and then a list of parcels where the water is being served. So that's new. Those are new additional reporting requirements that were never previously in effect.
Go ahead.
Well, when you said parcels, I understand agricultural parcels, but for the M&I,
Absolutely.
so what's a parcel in the city of Port Hueneme or within our agency?
Yeah, so it's let's just take a subdivision, for instance. You've got 50 homes, and each one sits on a parcel. And you would need to identify those parcels served. The agency.
Each home?
What's that?
Each home?
Yeah, I mean, that's a different way of stating it, but you could probably do it by assessor parcel number. I don't know. These issues still have to be worked out. I don't know that the GMA has really worked this stuff out. They've been trying to work out sort of the ordinance requirements and figuring they're going to be able to do this. I don't know that they've developed the forms, and PHWA certainly hasn't sat down with United to figure out how this reporting is going to take place. But the way the ordinance is drafted currently, it's a requirement.
And individual sites, homes, businesses, the same.
Absolutely.
It's a lot of numbers.
There's a heck of a lot of numbers, yes.
Thank you.
But, you know, we're talking about the Port Hueneme Water Agency, so it all relates back to the parcels under the purview of the PHWA. It wouldn't necessarily drill down to like somebody's house in the city, wouldn't it, Mr. City Attorney?
Understand, Mr. Candy, they're referring to a parcel, and what that means in this context is any separate legally described parcel on the Subdivision Map Act. So that means when you buy a piece of land, it's legally described either by meets and bounds, like 100 feet from this point, and then 90 degrees, or it's described as, if it's under a map act, as a particular, like lot 26 of tract number, whatever. That tract may have on it a 200-acre farm. It may have on it a single home. It may have on it a entire mall. It may have on it 3 or 4 stores. But it's the separate parcel that is described and which is being reported on. So it's not necessarily every business, because many businesses are located on one owner, one parcel, and are leased by the businesses. But it would include every separately owned home. You pay a tax on your house, which is under the assessor parcel number. That's probably, as Mr. Kennedy said, going to be the basis for how you report the parcels that are using water within your jurisdiction.
Yeah, that was a wonderful explanation. Thank you for that. It's
Wow.
consistent with, my understanding as well.
Up until now, we've just been doing the aggregate of what the Port Hueneme Water Agency uses. Is that how it worked? Total?
I think so. I mean, at least with respect to the extraction allocations, United has been reporting to the GMA the water that it pumps
I see.
at its OH facilities in El Rio and delivers down the pipeline. And whether or not the agency itself has been reporting the water that it's been delivered, I don't know about that.
Madam Chair?
Yes, Mr. City Attorney.
I want to make sure there's not a misunderstanding here. I understood you to say that we have to report the parcels that are using water, but at this point, there's nothing specific in the ordinance that says we have to report how much water is being used by each parcel. Is that correct?
That's my understanding. yeah.
Okay, so we have to just report the number describe the parcels so they know who's getting water, but we aren't going to have to, at least at this point, report the amount each separate individual parcel is being used. So I'd want to make that clear, because it's a considerably different burden.
Yeah, all right, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, so that covers reporting. Allocation carryover, this is kind of an interesting concept that's been around since the beginning of the initial drafts of the ordinance. It's another flexibility provision. It's intended to, allow folks to, if they don't use all their extraction allocation in a particular year, to carry over up to 50% of their unused allocation for use in the subsequent water year or any number of subsequent years. There's limitations, though. 50% limitation is how much you can carry over each year, and then you can't cumulatively have more than 100% allocation carryover at any one point in time, and that's 100% of your current allocation. So maybe just to put some numbers on it, if we started with a 1,000 acre foot per year allocation, 500 acre feet of that is unused. The agency wanted to carry over the balance of 500 unused. It could, but it could only do so for 2 years, because after 2 years it would then have reached its extraction allocation of 1,000 acre feet per year, and there'd be a limit, wouldn't be able to carry over anything more, and if you don't use the allocation, you don't use it, you're not incurring any surcharges, but you're certainly not maximizing the benefit of that allocation either. So managing allocation carryover, and then with respect to this agency's, we have to work that out with United, of course, because it's United that holds the allocation for the agency in trust, and that would be one of these details that we'd have to figure out with United moving forward as to how to handle that unused allocation. Questions came up about the take or pay under the OH pipeline agreement. Could there be possibly transfers of allocation, carryover allocation within the OH pipeline? I mean, I think absolutely yes. These are things that need to be discussed with United and then ultimately get sign off from the GMA. Any questions regarding that?
Any questions for Mr. Candy?
So if we go over, what happens?
If you go over, so it would actually be United as the operator of the facilities that would go over the extraction allocation, and then if they went over because they delivered the agency more water than the agency's sub-allocation permits, then they would charge the surcharge on to the agency, and the agency would have to pay up per the terms of the OH pipeline agreement.
So if we go over, there's a certain percentage we get from the groundwater and a certain percentage we get from Colegas.
Mm-hmm.
If we go over our allocation, do we then balance it out with Colegas and just have a higher percentage there, or what happens?
Well, one option would be to not exceed your allocation. In that case, you wouldn't incur any surcharges, but then, if possible, make up the balance of the need through Callegas deliveries of State Water Project water. Does that
Are
make
the
sense?
surcharges higher than what it would cost for us to get from Colegas?
That's a good question. So that's something that we'd have to look at, but that would be, yes, a financial decision. If it costs more to go to Callegas than it would to pay the surcharge, then perhaps you pay the surcharge.
The surcharge, the first 50 acre feet is set at the State Water Project Tier 1 rate. So if you exceed by 50 through the GMA, you pay the State Water Tier 1 rate. The next, I think, 100 or 150 is at Tier 2. And then after that, you get dinged at Tier 3 Callegas charge. So it's tied directly to metropolitan water rates.
Okay.
Just how bad you get dinged on it.
Yeah, so thanks for that. They've considered it, and it makes sense to probably just go get your surface water from Callegas, then incur surcharges. Okay, the next general category under this ordinance is allocation transfers. Again, a flexibility provision. Transfers are allowed. The GMA must find that they will not impede achievement of the sustainability goals. These are really interbasin transfers that we're talking about. If you wanted to contemplate a transfer of allocation from another basin, I think that would be more difficult to accomplish, and you'd certainly have to get the GMA to agree to that. Yeah, the flexibility is there if it's needed, and somebody's got some excess allocation that they don't think they're going to need for a year, maybe 2 years, and they could do a temporary transfer of that allocation. With respect to land conversions, it's a unique subset of transfers, and this ordinance makes it clear, it hasn't been clear in the past, that those transfers will be 1-to-1. So if agricultural land is using 1 acre foot of water and that land gets converted to an M&I use, then that 1 acre foot of water would be converted to or transferred to the M&I provider as, in addition to its existing allocation. Okay, reduction in allocation. So this is the part that is sort of remains to be determined. The first bullet there is just highlights the fact that reducing allocation, everybody down from their initial allocations, is the primary management action that the was identified in the groundwater sustainability plans for Oxnard, Pleasant Valley basins. The secondary management action identified was water projects that bring more water into the system, make more groundwater available to the extent that those projects are realized. That would bring the safe yield numbers up. I've got another slide that talks about the sustainable yield numbers, but those numbers would come up through new water projects and reduce the harshness of the ramping down or the reductions, theoretically. But again, the primary management tool that the GMA is relying on to achieve sustainability in 20 years is reductions. The board has said that they will determine the schedule and method for reducing extraction allocations following adoption of the GSPs. Again, the GSPs need to be adopted by January of 2020, the end of January, so not a lot of time there. And I have not heard anything from staff as to when they plan to roll out a draft of Phase 2 ordinance. But that'll be interesting to see, certainly when they do. Right now, there's not a whole lot of clarity on what they're thinking about. We don't know if they're talking about a straight linear reduction over a 20-year period, or whether they would prefer a stepped basis. I mean, my impression is they're really thinking about a linear ramp down over a 20-year period, but again, it doesn't have to be that, and it doesn't have to be 20 years, and I think opportunity exists now to be talking with the agency and agency staff to, if there's any preferred approaches, getting those approaches in front of them so they can vet them and hopefully get an ordinance that we can live with. It's going to be difficult on everybody, and I think a lot depends on how these reductions occur to determine who has to bear a lot of the brunt of these reductions. I mean, a big issue that's outstanding in my mind is how the variances are going to be handled. If a bunch of agricultural operators and even M&I providers go and are able to get increases to their allocations through variances, that changes the percentages effectively that everybody's got, what their piece of the pie is, and if it's a straight linear ramp down, they've acquired a bigger piece of that small pie at the end of the day. So I haven't heard anything. Last time I spoke to GMA staff about this was probably a month and a half ago, before they adopted their ordinance, and they indicated to me that they had a full plate trying to get their ordinance through and hadn't really begun to really kind of work out these issues. I'm sure they've been thinking about them, but they haven't indicated, what direction they're going to go.
There's a couple questions here.
So, from an agricultural standpoint, they change the type of crop that they want to grow, and one requires more or less water based on that particular crop. How are they looking to manage that?
Well, at the first level, whatever extraction facility serves that piece of land has an allocation under this ordinance, presumably, and they would have to live within that allocation. There's no more irrigation efficiency that we saw under Emergency Ordinance E, so they'd have to live within that allocation. Now, if they were able to meet the requirements for a variance and were able to get a variance approved by the GMA, then they could increase their extraction allocation by the amount of that variance, and would be able to pump that water until the reductions hit. Again, how those variances are going to be handled under any future reduction scenario, we don't know yet. So.
Yes, Nathan.
Now that we're kind of getting through all the allocation slides, did the GMA staff have an idea of when they're going to publish the allocations? Because with PHWA under the United in Trust, how they do their math with their full allocation is gonna be something we need to negotiate. And I know PHWA, former GMs, have had specific numbers that we really thought were our allocation, but when the math comes out, you know, it might differ from what GMA staff has. So do
Well,
they have a
the
schedule?
ordinance becomes effective 30 days after adoption. So on November 23rd, the ordinance will become effective. However, it doesn't become operative. The ordinance states that it won't take effect and won't be applied until October of 2020. My understanding is that the GMA is going to, first part of this next year, put out what they believe all the different parties' initial extraction allocations are, or will be under the new ordinance, and then those will take effect in October of 2020. So, again, yeah, I don't have any specific dates. They haven't provided any specific dates, but just the general sense is they understand that this is an issue and folks need to know what they're dealing with, and they need some lead time, and so sometime in the late winter, early spring of next year, I'd be expecting to see initial allocations.
And a following question to that, since it is October 1, 2020, and emergency ordinance E is now gone, this water year, how are they regulating?
It's a no. Ordinance E is not gone. This this ordinance will replace Ordinance E when it becomes operative, but between now and October 1st of 2020, it's Ordinance E in place with an amendment to Ordinance E that took place. The board, on the same day that it approved this pumping allocation ordinance, also changed Emergency Ordinance E to eliminate the 20% reduction requirement for M&I. So, depending on how you look at it, maybe a gift to M&I, but the agency, United Water Conservation District, will be operated under the allocation for this coming year will be the unreduced T number, which is, I've got those numbers here, if you just give me a second. So we're expecting to see an initial allocation for PHWA of 4,525 acre feet, approximately, around there. That's based on numbers that we worked through with Curtis Hopkins, who was doing this on behalf of the city of Oxnard and really on behalf of the whole M&I group. It looks like that's the average annual extractions or deliveries to, I don't want to say deliveries, but annual average extractions during the base period that's attributable to PHWA. So right around 4,500 and some change acre feet per year. PHWA's unreduced T, that number is 4,572 acre feet per year, but the real number is more around 4,442 because of operations and line loss. So that's really what the unreduced T number is, 4,442 acre feet per year. PHWA's initial allocation when this ordinance takes effect, they'll be slightly higher than that, right around 4,525. When the GMA publishes the initial allocations, the number is significantly different, then we're going to have a problem, and we'll raise it at that time. But we're expecting to see initial allocation about 4,500 acre feet per year.
But the GMA will only show up for United. They will not break it down any further, correct?
That's an interesting question. They may try to break it down. If they don't break it down, we certainly will need to break it down with United.
And that's really looking at then the schedule, like what we see is possibly,
The schedule in terms of what
in terms of breaking it down to like a.
Yes, absolutely. So that's what we expect to see PHWA's initial allocation, and really when I say initial allocation, I'm talking about suballocation on the OH pipeline. United's allocation for its OH facilities is going to be a lot larger number than that. PHWA makes up, I forget the percentage, but about 40%. So it's going to be 60% higher than the PHWA number. Okay, so just these are kind of minor points here, these last two bullets. A minimum allocation for agricultural operations. These minimum allocations will be exempt from reductions. This is what the board has said that they intend to do. Again, that's going to be phase 2. We don't know what that amount is. I don't have any idea at this point what the minimum allocation might be for agricultural operations or what that exemption might be. I can't imagine it's going to be a huge amount of water for ag, but just something to keep a place marker. So these numbers are interesting, the sustainable yield numbers. So these numbers come out of the draft groundwater sustainability plans for the Oxnard and Pleasant Valley basins. These are the numbers that everybody's going to have to reduce down to. And if you add up these numbers, what you get is roughly 50,000 acre feet per year, give or take, 6,000 to 9,000 acre feet of sustainable yield. And in the absence of any significant water projects that lift these numbers, this is what everybody's going to have to live within. And it's again, we're expecting to see a ramp down of over 20 years. And it'll be hopefully, gradual ramp down or a set ramp down, and but ultimately in 20 years, this is what SIGMA, the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, would require everybody to live within, and that's what the GMA is shooting for. So the way I look at it, my understanding, and maybe some folks here have some better ideas, but I'm hearing numbers around 100,000 acre feet per year, maybe 110,000 acre feet per year that's current pumping. If everybody's going to have to reduce down and it's linear and fair, everybody's going to have to cut by over 50%. So in 20 years, if we start with 4,500 acre feet allocation, that's going to be cut in half over a 20-year period, and that's the planning that the agency's going to have to go through to figure out where they're going to be and how they're going to be able to provide water service 20 years down the road. We talked about the variance procedure. It's I don't think there's anything really new about the variance procedure that's in this ordinance as compared to past ordinances of the GMA. I think the key thing to consider is that you need to demonstrate, and we've got the burden of proof. The party applying for the variance has a burden of proving special circumstances or exceptional characteristics which do not apply generally to other comparable owners or operators. The deadline for applying for a variance for the water year beginning October 1st, 2020 is June 30th. And PHWA is going to need to determine whether they intend to seek a variance, and that probably should be something that the agency thinks about fairly soon in order to give enough lead time to get an application in by June 30th that actually can demonstrate the need for the variance and these special circumstances.
Yeah, ex officio Jacobson, do you have something there?
Yeah, you mentioned earlier that there was more groups that were not, did not like the base period. Would it be advantageous for us to try to team with them because it's a similar issue, or go about this on our own?
Well, you're speaking about the ag folks, and it's always good to talk to everybody, but I do think that in terms of the variance, the circumstances are going to be unique to each party applying for variance. They're going to have to prove up their own special circumstances, exceptional characteristics. And so while it might help to coordinate, I don't know that, we're gonna be able to submit anything like a joint application. It wouldn't be that level. But most definitely, the way the ordinance are written, again, it's the operator that applies for variance, and that operator, in our case, is United Water Conservation District. So we are probably going to need to be walking hand in hand into the GMA's office with the application if the agency decides to move forward with a variance, and we're going to need to figure that out. Now, just having looked at this a little bit, in terms of whether or not the agency could meet the burden of proof for a variance, it does appear that in that last couple of years of the base period, 2013, 2014, PHWA was using less water as a result of not using its reverse osmosis treatment facilities. When those treatment facilities are operational, you need to move more water through them to deal with there's a certain amount of reject. And if you're bypassing those facilities, you don't have to account for that additional reject water, and so you're actually using less water. And that may be a viable basis to go to the GMA and say, this base period doesn't work for us fairly. We have circumstances that don't apply to other operators generally, and we think this justifies a variance.
Now, do we have an idea of what that number might be, Mr. Villafana?
We do, there's a percentage, it's, I believe it's about 15% rejection. I'd have to confirm the exact numbers. It also depends on the condition of our membranes. We do periodic back flushing, so when we do that, it increases the efficiency. So then we get less water that has to be discharged into the brine. I can come back with a specific number and get that historic.
Yeah, I would think that this group would need to entertain the idea of applying for a variance or working with United, but we'll have you finish this discussion. But I think that's really important.
And there's maybe other factors as well that we could bring to bear with respect to the beach district and the beach district's particular circumstances where they weren't using as much water, the Navy as well. So PHWA member agencies, there could be multiple grounds upon which we move for a variance and try to get approval of that.
Okay.
Periodic review, this is just a general Sigma requirement that, every 5 years the GMA needs to come back, and this applies to groundwater sustainability plans in general, but they've adopted this for their ordinance component of the groundwater sustainability plan. They're committed to every 5 years, relooking at the ordinance and making tweaks. So that process presumably is there if things aren't working out well or as they anticipated. So this slide just
And this is, excuse me, so the periodic review every 5 years, that would be within the 20-year period?
Yes, every 5 years going forward, and the way the ordinance is written, if I recall, it doesn't limit it to 20 years. So every 5 years ad infinitum.
Okay.
They've committed to come back and reviewing the ordinance to make sure it's working and tweaking it as necessary. The ordinance becomes effective as I indicated, November 23rd. Becomes operative October 1st. We've got emergency ordinance E that's in place until then, and then we've got this relaxation of the requirements under emergency ordinance E that applies to M&I operators only, not ag operators. And so for the next year, we get to operate, or United can pump the unreduced T's numbers, and that roughly approximates where we'll be at when this ordinance goes into effect. It becomes operative October 1st, 2020. The last slide that I have is next steps. Let's just try to bring it together. I think we've talked about pretty much every one of these. We do need to confirm PHWA's initial allocation. When those numbers are published, again, that's this coming year. Hopefully, the earlier the better. The agency needs to determine whether it intends to pursue a variance. We'll definitely need to meet with United representatives to discuss aspects of ordinance implementation. That would be, variance for sure, reporting of water use, take or pay provisions, carryover provisions, how all that's going to work internally among OH pipeline contractors. And then the last bullet is planning for phase 2 allocation reductions. We know that at this point in time we're looking at 50% reduction over 20 years. And so there's some long-term planning that needs to occur in terms of how water would be provided, when we get into the leaner years of this allocation ordinance program. That completes my presentation. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Candy. Are there any questions from the committee here?
So the 50% reduction will be each year, kind of a percentage, or will it be every 5 years, or how?
So we don't know. The 50% reduction is over the 20-year period in the aggregate. Just based on how much water is being pumped from the basin now, anecdotal evidence is it's over 100,000 acre feet per year. If everybody pumping from the basin collectively needs to live within around 50,000 acre feet per year, that's roughly a 50% reduction. And just assuming that that's imposed evenly and equitably amongst all parties over that 20-year period, for the first year you can pump the initial allocation, but slowly you get ramped down to 50% of that 4,500 acre foot per year number.
And that's consistent, the farming and the everyday users, is it consistent, the percentage, or is it like so the farm's going to have to reduce 50%, we're going to have to reduce 50%?
Yes, so again, we don't know what the reduction portion of the ordinance looks like, the second half of the ordinance, so we don't know exactly how the reductions will occur. All we know now is what the initial allocations are. We also have an idea of what the sustainable yield numbers are that the GMA is going to adopt and then will become part of the program, so we know where everybody's got to get down to. And again, if M&I is treated in the same manner as ag, and ag is treated the same as M&I, then everybody will have to reduce at least 50%, it seems, to get to the numbers where we need to be in 20 years.
I think I know what M&I means, but what does it mean?
Oh, I'm sorry. Municipal and industrial.
Okay.
It's shorthand term for,
Okay.
as opposed to agricultural water use. And
Just a quick question. I know there were various agencies contesting this, maybe all the agencies. Have most of the agencies now come together and they're sort of realizing they have to live with this, or is there still contention out there?
well, there's still dissatisfaction. I don't think that this ordinance makes anybody really happy. There's been different concessions made to different parties. My sense is that most of the M&I group is willing to live with the ordinance, and in other words, not launch a program of litigation to try to challenge it. I don't know about the ag folks, and in particular a spin-off of the OPV landowner group that they were not happy with the way that the base allocation issue came out, and they are some fairly prominent landowners in the basin that have threatened to sue and challenge this ordinance. So that remains to be seen whether they do or not. But no, I wouldn't say that everybody's Yeah, nobody's happy about it, but,
equally unhappy.
yeah.
What was the O? Was that Pleasant Valley? No.
Yeah, the OPV, so that's Oxnard Pleasant Valley Basins, and then there was a landowner group that was meeting to try to, so this is early on in the ordinance formation process and some of the earlier drafts. The M&I group was meeting to try to get consensus around what was important for M&I. The agricultural landowners were meeting to try to get consensus around issues. The two groups were coming together to meet. They were fairly successful in coming up with a program that they introduced to the GMA. The GMA took that and changed a lot of those provisions, so a lot of the parties, stakeholders felt like they had been taken advantage of. They had been made promises that the GMA did not keep. But in particular, the landowner group factioned between those that supported this base period, 2005-2014, basically the folks who were pumping a lot of water during that base period, love the base period, those folks that, for whatever reason, were not pumping a lot of water, or more recently, in the last 3 or 4 years, have brought land into production that wasn't previously in production, are completely left out of that base period. So they have a significant issue where they feel disenfranchised under this ordinance, and they feel like their water rights, they have overlying water rights, which give them the ability to use as much as they need, as long as they own land overlying the basin. They feel like this ordinance completely flies in the face of their water rights, and have threatened to sue over it.
But this is not the entire plain, Oxnard, Pleasant Valley plain, or landmass. This is just specific groups within that ag community.
Yes, the specific group.
Yes.
I'd just like to state for the record, for clarification, since you all are aware, that I do serve as the general manager for Pleasant Valley County Water District, who is an agricultural water agency, separate from that of the Oxnard Pleasant Valley Users Group, which is what Council Candy has been referring to and the concern. So just wanted to make that determination that it's not the agency that I serve as the general manager for that has created the latest set of concerns.
Jared,
Okay.
can you just describe very quickly who's in that group?
It's a volunteer group of landowners who have agreed to self-assess themselves, and it's wide-ranging amongst the entire overlying basin of the Oxnard and Pleasant Valley Basin. So many of them have land in both basins, and not unique to one basin or the other. And it's an overlying rights issue, as Mr. Candy referred to, and Pleasant Valley County Water District does not farm any land or own land to make an overlying right argument.
Okay, thanks for that clarification. Yes, Member Rollins?
So ultimately, there's the assumption that we're going to have 50% less water in the next 20 years, and that's why we're reducing it that much. Or let's say they're wrong, or they underestimated. Maybe we have less than that amount of money. Less than that amount of water in the next 20 years, or we have more than. What's the logic behind what they're planning to do?
Well, that's the purpose of the 5-year reviews, where they'll come back and look at these numbers. I think everybody's hopeful that there will be water supply projects that come online and add to the available groundwater supply. And if that's the case, then the sustainable yield numbers would come up, and the ramp down will be less severe. But I think where things are looking right now, a conservative projection would be the agency would need to reduce its groundwater consumption by 50% over the next 20 years, so that 20 years from now, they're using 50% groundwater than they're using today. Now, that doesn't mean they can't make up that supply with, other supplies, but that is just a conservative projection. Many things could change during the interim. They've also been talking about water markets and different ways to ameliorate the impact of all this, but if none of that happens, and there's no water projects that come online, and they are accurate in their assessment of what the sustainable yield is, and it looks like it's going to be a 50% reduction in groundwater, that'll have to take place gradually over the 20-year period.
Member Jacobson?
Didn't speak to the the extraction fees that the GMA will be assessing. My understanding it's going to go to United, so will it be in the same timeline as the allocations that they will publish, or have they published what their fee rate or extraction fees will be?
I'm not aware of them having published that. No, but these are the fees for assessments to fund water supply projects, and
Correct,
I
per
think
acre foot, the replenishment fee.
exactly,
Thank
the
you.
replenishment fee. So that is also part of the Phase 2 ordinance. There's
That's
nothing in Phase 1 that addressed that, and what they're thinking is along those lines. I've heard like 100. I don't want to speak out of turn as to what those might be, but
But they will not be active October 1.
they may be if the GMA is able to come up with an ordinance that implements the replenishment fee by October 1. They could certainly get that done over the course of the coming months and make that operative October 1st to coincide with the operative date of this ordinance.
Okay, thank you.
So when we talk about the reduction in groundwater of 50% over 20 years, that's what we're looking at now, and it doesn't mean that this agency can't look at other opportunities to, to find additional sources of water like desal, like reuse, like those kinds of other things, right? Certainly we're not in this alone, but we have to look out for our what's going to be best for this organization. And so I would like for us to then have it be that we bring it back onto another agenda to then take a look at discussing then a variance and applying for that, discussing it. I mean, but, we can get to that point of, is this what's going to be best for this organization? And really delving into that. Okay, so any further questions for Mr. Candy or Mr. Villafana then? No? Okay, so at this time, then thank you, Mr. Candy. Thank you for a comprehensive
Thank you.
report. At this point then, it's recommended that we receive and file the report.
Move to receive and file.
Second.
There's a motion and a second. All those in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? None. So motion carries unanimously. And we are now on to the part of the agenda for board member reports, comments, and requests for future agenda items. Yes, go ahead, member.
I'm just going to
Fisher.
have to excuse myself. Normally, we're out of here at 5, and I scheduled myself a little tight, so I'm going to have to move on. So
Okay.
thank you all, and have a good evening.
All right, thank you. So, anyone else as part of the dais for any reports, comments, or requests?
Just
Yes,
my-
member Rollins.
Yeah, this is timely in that this weekend I went on a inspection tour from Oroville, where they were talking about this very issue from a statewide issue as far as like the ground management plan and then the sustainability plan and then the evaluation plan. So I knew it was coming.
Yeah. All right. Marcus and,
Did the reservoirs still look pretty good up north, or? are they-
Yes, actually, they do look quite good right now.
Okay.
But I guess the big issue right now is like, you know, the delta and how that's been reconfigured and how it's affecting the farmers and the users. So, and, you know, each group has their priorities. Everything, from what I gathered, you have the farmers, you have the users, being us, and then you have the fish. And the fish, the conservationists and the fish. And so each one has their different priorities.
Okay. Well, for me, I just want to put on the agenda the discussion about applying for a variance. And so if we could have that be on the agenda for January, that would be best. Also looking at, or December, whatever works.
Make sure that they firmed up the provisions for how to do a variance, and right now we don't know what that is.
And do we expect to know within the next couple of weeks, or is it going to be something you think would be first part of the new year, Mr. Candy?
In the next couple weeks, expect.
For the variance,
Yeah, so I think it's the same variance procedure that is, you know, standard with the GMA. This, again, I'm not aware of any significant changes that were adopted in this ordinance that change that procedure. The deadline, though, is June 30th of this coming year to file an application if you plan to have your variance approved by the time that these ordinance provisions are adopted. So there would need to be.
But it's United that actually files it, so we need to start well in advance to work with them to get them to do that.
It is, yeah.
Absolutely, right, yes.
Yeah.
Mhm.
yeah, it is working with United, yeah. So I would think the sooner we get it on the agenda to then say yes or no and then move forward to start working with United is probably the best.
May I ask?
Yes, Mr.
Mr. Candy, do you have any sense of the position that United would take on variances among its contractors?
I think that the agency, and we've tried to develop a strong relationship with United, I don't believe United would have a problem. I mean, it's just, they're the system operator. And if PHWA is able through them to acquire an increase in their allocation through variance, I don't see why they'd have a problem.
It probably adds to, you know, their operating efficiency and so on. If the more water they're running through their system, it'd probably be beneficial to them.
Yeah, and there's some precedent for variances amongst OH pipeline contractors. So I don't
Good.
see that as a problem until it is one. I don't think it is.
Thank you.
Okay, so if we can have this on the December agenda, that would be super. So if there aren't any other questions, then we'll go ahead and adjourn the Port Hueneme Water Agency to the next regular meeting scheduled for Monday, December 16th, 2019, here at 4 p.m. at City Hall Council Chambers. Thanks.